Nobody knows even why some houses are called haunted.
What would you call this place?
A deranged house, isn't there? Such houses are described in the Bible as leprous. Before that, in Homer's phrase for the underworld, a house of Hades.
And you really believe that this was possible? That apes were systematically taken from this planet to another and altered? Selective breeding, atomic surgery, methods we can't guess, and return new faculties instilled by intelligence, perhaps something else. In effect, a colonization. Dr. Roney and I are satisfied that these arthropods are not of this earth.
Hi everybody, this is the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show of the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Irene Allen Block, and with me tonight is my new co-host, Andy Mercer.
Yes, it is. I'm afraid I have taken over. I have decided to become in charge and told no, not really. No, Mark has decided to move on and do something else. So if you're a regular to the show, you'll notice I'm obviously not Mark Johnson. Mark will be around. He's got his own show, hasn't he, Irene? He's doing on a semi-regular basis now to give himself a bit more free time.
Perceptions.
That's it. So what's it about, just briefly?
It's about quite a few things, really. You know, I can't really explain because I haven't yet had time to listen to the shows.
Okay, fair enough.
So you've put me on an awkward spot now, haven't you? And I'm going to get a rollicking from Mark tomorrow.
Well, I thought you at least know what that was about. But I mean, I have had a bit of a listen. And he's kind of, should we say, more spiritual path, shall we say? I mean, it's not obviously not outside the remit of the network itself, but it's. I think he wanted to pursue something a little different to what we've been, what you guys have been doing really the last few years. Kind of a more
spiritual and well-being and things like that.
Yeah, sort of higher awareness sort of thing.
Whereas we're spooky, horror and nightmarish.
Yeah, we're the scary people now. The scarier topics and the mysterious stuff, the strange and the sinister, which is what we try to do, really.
Yeah, we got a scary one with us tonight too, haven't we?
Well, I mean, there's a number of ways you can describe our guest this evening, but he is a man of many talents. He's someone that I've got to know over the last couple of years really quite well, though we've still never met and probably never going to, unfortunately, because we're still other parts of the world. But Steve and I have chatted about a lot of stuff. He's the main host of the High Strangeness Factor, which is a show I occasionally pop up on, which
and also plays on this network.
Absolutely, it does. And it's been a bit quiet for a little while for a number of reasons, which we're going to get into a little bit later on. But Steve Ward has been the regular host of the High Strangeness Factor. He's also occasionally pops up at Matt Maloney's X-Files show, and has done other things in his life and has lots of interesting areas he's explored, one of which we're certainly going to talk about again this evening. But first of all, I'd like to say hello, Steve. Welcome aboard.
Hey, it's great to be here. Great
Hello,
to be back,
Steve.
actually. Hi, Irene.
Hello, Steve.
Yes, I've been on a bit of a hiatus. I have been, I moved. I'm a displaced Michigander now, living deep in the Ohio Valley. So I won't go into all the trials and travails of moving because we've all been there. But this was a pretty painful one. I have all kinds of books, and one of the over here we have a company that's called Two Men in a Truck. And you hire them.
2 men in a truck.
Movers, right? Okay, maybe you got them over there too. I don't know, but
no.
they, but the guys I had were just they were fantastic. But one of the guys said that he thought I had more books than his hometown library. So, and I still that my house is still disorganized. I've still got a path I can walk through. I brought with me about 6 or 8 shelves. Plus, I purchased about 18 shelves and put them together of various descriptions. And I still have not, I'm a long ways from being organized, but once I'm done, I will have a great research library.
Excellent. It's one of those things that kind of fills me with dread, the whole notion of trying to pack up your library of books, because they always look like, okay, perhaps not really organised, but they sort of sit nicely on the shelf, and you think that would be too much to move. Then you start packing them into boxes, and you think, oh my God.
Yeah, they fill me with dread as well. You've got to keep getting the duster out.
Oh, that's not more about dusting, just sort of blow them occasionally as you work out. Okay.
Well, you get You blow them, do you?
Yeah, it's just blow on the dust. Just and off it goes, you know. Only the book I'm picking up. The others, it doesn't matter. I mean, the dust protects them. You see, it gives a little sheen and layer of protection against.
I'll remember that one when my old man comes home and says, "Cole, you haven't dusted this week. You haven't done a lot of housework this week. Look at the dust." I'll tell you, well, it gives it protection.
It's your protective layer, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think,
if you were like I was, you know how your books first are kind of centralized, but then they're all over the house, everywhere, every room, in the front room, behind the chair, and I'm going to try to get. Well, they're going to be all over the house again, but they're going to be in specific shelves with kind of a general organization, I hope. But I had just one last thing, and I won't bore you with my all my details of moving, but didn't have everything. I still had a bunch of boxes and books and everything in a storage unit back in the town where I used to live. So one day I rented a cargo van, and I went from Point Pleasant back to Michigan, hit the storage unit, unloaded it, barely crammed everything in. It was comical to see me slam these doors, the side door and the back door, to get it, because I wasn't going to go back again. And it was an 18-hour run, and I got everything back. Then I collapsed that night, and the next day it took me all day to get these boxes in here. There's still a million of them in the basement unpacked. And anyway, it's a nightmare. But I figured by the Mothman Festival, I'm going to be good, which I'm going to have to be, because I'm going to have some guests arriving at my house.
Right. Yes. Before you go any further, and we're talking about books, I want to tell everybody my latest book on the psychic spy.
Oh, yes.
Ville de Luminaire, City of Lights, has been released.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that way. And also, when you speak to Commander Cobra, will you tell him I mentioned him in my book?
Ooh.
Oh, yes, I will. I just talked to him yesterday, and I'll send him a message.
He helped me with a bit of a flying problem. So.
Okay. Well, he definitely knows about flying.
So that's the sequel to The Psychic Spy Recruited. It is The Psychic Spy Ville de Luminaire. Everybody,
Excellent.
Go out and get it.
Holiday reading, sit on the beach reading Irene's book. Sounds like a good idea.
It's a bit naughty in places.
Well, it should be. I think it will keep it interesting.
Spies go together, don't they?
Got to keep it interesting. It'll be sort of all James Bond type thing, you know, so fun and adventure. But the female lead, that's the good thing about
it.
He
didn't go, with the James Bond series and everything, they don't go into much detail. It just leaves it to the imagination.
Oh,
I've gone into a little bit too much detail at some points, I think. Leaves nothing to the imagination.
Make sure this goes out after the watershed then. Now, Steve, I think you gave away the big secret about your move, of where you've moved to.
Ooh.
Yes, well, I've been posting photographs and all over Facebook, so people have finally deduced that I have moved to. I'm in what they call West by God, Virginia. I am the little house I'm in is actually inches from downtown Point Pleasant. Yeah. I am not too far from the road with the Scarberries and the Mallets were chased by the Mothman in November of '66 in their car. I can step out of the door of my house and I can look down the street. I can see the flood wall to the Ohio River, and I can literally walk downtown to where I'm working now at the Mothman Museum. I can pass 6th Street. 6th Street was where the Silver Bridge used to stand, but that fell in December 15th, 1967. So
it was quite a big bridge, wasn't
it? Well, it was it spanned the Ohio River from Point Pleasant over to Kanawha or Gallipolis in that area. And it was built in 1928 and wasn't really designed for the traffic of the 1960s. And it turned out that it was the 13th I-bar they determined had a flaw in it. And just after 5 o'clock on December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge went into the Ohio. It only took about 30 to 40 seconds.
And there were cars on it at the time.
Yes, 30-some cars. The sun was almost down. It was about 20 degrees out. The light had stuck. And so it was filled with cars, rush hour traffic and Christmas traffic as well. So it was completely unexpected and quite a tragedy.
Yeah. In fact, you know, tell me if I'm wrong, because I vaguely remember this story. Was it the time that the bridge collapsed that the Mothman was seen in the vicinity?
I don't think so. I think that's a story that I keep hearing that too, but I don't believe it's true. Uh, now, there's some people said they saw a light, a flash of light. John Keel, who wrote the Mothman Prophecies and did his investigations that year, believes that the flash of light was probably the power lines snapping when the bridge went down. I don't think the Mothman was seen right near the bridge, but I could come across. You have to be careful with things like that, because after the fact, you get all kinds of stories about what happened or what people saw.
Yeah, it's like Chinese whispers, isn't it?
Especially as the whole story about the Mothman had begun to really circulate around the town anyway. But I tell you, let's go back a little bit, because I know you've talked about this more times you want to even remember, Steve. Can you just give us an idea of what on earth was actually going on before the bridge collapsed, the whole Mothman story?
Well, there were a couple of sightings earlier, but the major sighting was November 15th, 1966. This 9 miles north of Point Pleasant is what they call the TNT area. Now, this was an area that during World War II, and you can, if you go on Google, you can see these amazing black and white photographs of this huge complex where they made TNT and explosives for the war effort. And they stored them in 100 of these concrete bunkers. They call them igloos. And the bunkers are still out there. And some of them are accessible. This area is now the McClintock Wildlife Area. It's very, very creepy. In the 1960s, when it became kind of a lover's lane, and the Scarberries and the Mallets were two married couples that were just driving out there to see if they could find any of their friends. And by this time, there wasn't much left of the complex. The old North Power Plant was there. There are still some old concrete structures here and there, but it really looks like a scene out of the time machine. It's eerie in the daytime, extremely creepy at night. So they were by the old North Power Plant. Now, I am working at the Mothman Museum. Jeff Walmsley, who co-founded the Mothman Festival and started the Mothman Museum, he was about 5 or 6 years old when all this happened. He was about 5 when these sightings started to take place, and 6 when the bridge went down. He grew up with some of the witnesses. They lived right on the same street he did. Linda Scarberry, he was her paper boy, and they became friends. And he would have Linda and some of the other original witnesses, while they were still with us, come to the Mothman Festival, and people could talk to them about their experience. Well, one day, Jeff went out to the area where the old power plant used to stand. It's long gone now. It's been torn down. And she took him through these events get retold and retold. So she told him exactly what happened. So they were driving, she and her husband and their friends were driving along this dirt road next to the old North Power Plant. And she saw in the road, now it's dark, she saw in the road what she thought was a man. And she said, "What's that man doing standing there?" Then all of a sudden that man's wings went out, spread out like bat wings. And they noticed the red glowing eyes. And now this thing didn't take off right away. It seemed to shuffle along the ground and go into the old North Power Plant. Well, it didn't take them long to take off, and they headed south down Route 62 into Point Pleasant. And this thing started to chase them, so they said. And they went to the police station. Jeff Walmsley has the written accounts. The police chief separated them and had them tell their stories. So Jeff has these accounts posted up in the museum, and he also has them in one of his books called Mothman Behind the Red Eyes. So, and Jeff, by the way, if you go into the Mothman Museum, he has done a phenomenal job over the years of collecting all the history and the folklore of the incidents. And even along one wall, he has this great movie memorabilia of the film The Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere. But so anyway, this particular sighting, this first sighting, I remember it. I was in junior high school in Michigan, just north of Detroit. And I thought, how cool is this? We've got a winged humanoid chasing this couple down this lonely country road. A few months before, in March of 1966, we had a huge UFO flap in Michigan. And that was the one where Dr. J. Allen Hynek was still attached to the Air Force, Project Blue Book. And he came to investigate. He actually was, he asked the Air Force, he said, look, there's something going on in Michigan. Do you want me to check it out? And they said, oh, no, nobody's contacted us. And then Senator Gerald Ford, who later became president, was pretty angry because a lot of his constituents were very credible people that were seeing these things. So he contacted the Air Force and said they better do something about it and get down there. So the next day, Hynek was there. Now, unfortunately, he was still while he was beginning to believe that there was really something to this. He started out as a skeptic. He was an astronomer at Northwestern University. He still had to kind of straddle the fence. So I remember seeing this live when I was a kid. He's doing the press conference. And back then, I didn't know what was going on in his head, that he was tied to the Air Force still and all that. But he suggested that some of the sightings were swamp gas. Well, that's all the press needed. The mystery solved. And from then on, the joke has been running about swamp gas forever. Just as a side thing, 10 years later, I saw Dr. Hynek at a MUFON symposium in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ann Arbor was one of the places where they were seeing these things. Now, by this time, he had separated from the Air Force. He had started the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois, and became one of the good guys. And the name of his talk was called Swamp Gas Plus 10 and Counting. And well, it was a serious talk. There was a lot of humor in it, talking about the old days. So here I'm a kid in junior high, and we've got this wave of UFO sightings, followed the following November with the first sighting of the Mothman, not the first one, but the first major one, even before Mothman had a name. But then the following year, John Keel heard about this. He came down and started interviewing people. He thought people were just seeing an oversized bird at one point, and he joked that he was going to get his 14-foot monster traps out there and catch it. But once he got down there, he found that people were having all kinds of bizarre experiences, seeing strange lights in the sky, bedroom apparitions, bedroom invaders, psychic phenomena. A lot of the people that saw the Mothman would go home and have an outbreak of poltergeist phenomena. There were a lot of other problems with this creature, sort of a paradox that didn't make any sense. But that's how it started. And over the period of a year, Keel interviewed a little over 100 people that saw essentially the same thing. The physical description was very similar, but there were a lot of things going on at that time, that year.
It's incredible, really, that such a relatively small area then suddenly has this strange occurrence, and almost like half the world just seemed to descend upon it when it became kind of more well known and more spread around. But I suppose I always find myself wondering, how much of it is definitely people actually saw stuff, and how much was other people kind of getting in on the story, perhaps, and have their own experience to get interviewed or appear on the radio? Do you think there was much in the way of people adding to stories, or how much was it like really the events that were going on?
I think there was a core where things were really going on. Now, there was a man, one of the witnesses who I was able to talk to some years ago, Tom Urey. Now, he did not see the Mothman per se. He saw essentially a thunderbird, a very large bird with about a 10 to 12-foot wingspan. And I was talking to him, several years ago at the Mothman Festival. Sitting next to him is Linda Scarberry, and also Faye DeWitt was there. Well, this was the first time he met those ladies. You think that people that all come from a small town, they all know each other. Well, not always. This is the first time he met them. But Tom told me, he said originally he thought they were all seeing what he saw, this large bird, but they just sort of freaked out and added details. But then there was another witness named Marcella Bennett, who I never met, but he met her when they were filming the Mothman Prophecies movie. It was in Katanning, Pennsylvania. They used Katanning to substitute for Point Pleasant. So they were traveling down there as part of a publicity tour. And Tom for the first time, talked to Marcella Bennett. So he said, well, let's tell each other our stories. So she was the one that went out to the TNT area with her brother. They thought the Mothman was a big joke. They were going to go out and knock on the windows of some friends of theirs and try and scare them. So they went out there. Nobody was home. And so they're going back to the car. And all of a sudden, this thing rises from the ground, the Mothman. Marcella Bennett freaks out. She collapses. She actually falls on her infant child, who turned out to be okay. But I saw long form interviews with her, and she was rattled for years. She wouldn't drive at night. It just really freaked her out. But the point is that Tom Ury, that they had seen something different. And but he actually had to meet some of the other witnesses and talk to them. So but here's the thing. There's several paradoxes. The creature was about 6 to 7 feet tall, roughly man-like, red glowing eyes, although it almost seemed like the eyes were down in a chest, so to speak, almost like a big owl. But I don't know about any owls that are 6 or 7 foot tall. No. Now this thing also, it didn't always flap its wings. It would sometimes put its wings behind it and take off straight like a helicopter. That's so, and then was it an apparition? Keel found these strange footprints near the old North Power Plant. One person, one public official there who wasn't named, went out on his front porch and saw this thing, went into a trance for about 10 or 15 minutes, came out of it, and then this thing takes off. Now, here's one thing. Now, Keel was all about, he started to find that there were patterns, connections, parallels in all these things. And he also was finding that certain individuals would have experiences all their life. If you questioned them, you'd find out that the UFO they saw or the cryptid or whatever was just one piece of a bigger puzzle. And so he found that well, okay, here's another wrench in it. Some of the people that had a close sighting of it said it almost sounded like there was a humming noise or something mechanical coming from it. So what the heck was this thing? He found that one of the things he writes in his books, he said he found that people that experienced UFOs and cryptids separately, they would suffer sometimes the same physical ailments. Aches and pains, headaches, or whatever. Connie Carpenter was one of the original witnesses. She was a young woman about 20. She was driving next to the Mason County golf course. She sees this thing, this man-like thing with wings standing there, red glowing eyes, really unnerved her. It takes off straight like a helicopter. The next day, she's suffering from conjunctivitis, much the same way that people that have close encounters with a strange light or a UFO do. Mm-hmm. So Keel seemed to be onto something when he found that it was suggesting perhaps, I think these are the things that made him begin to think that perhaps there was a commonality to some of these things, that perhaps the projection or the image, maybe we shouldn't get so wrapped up in what it looks like to try to categorize it. Maybe there's something more significant behind it. But I do think that there was a core to these things. Now later on, you get people that say, well, yes, we saw the Mothman, but we didn't say anything about it back then because, and I've talked to some of the locals and they said that they were just, they were vehement. They said, back then you just didn't talk about this kind of stuff. Here it is, so the Bible Belt, very straight laced and very proper. You didn't talk about stuff like this. So I do think there was definitely a core to it.
Steve, sorry.
Yes.
Andy. Steve, has anybody ever tried to find out a noise that a moth would make? When like a bee makes a droning noise, doesn't it?
Well, I'm
actually. I'm wondering whether there's anybody ever put some really strong microphone near a moth to see whether it makes the same sort of noise.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't know if they must make some kind of give off some kind of frequency or whatever. But people did hear this thing. They said it sounded like a squeaky fan belt when they would hear it, like a large mouse or something like that. Well, heck, it seems like Mothman should sound more like Mothra or something like, or Godzilla than a little squeaky mouse. So now when we fly the Mothman, at the Mothman Festival during the hayride in the TNT area on Saturday night, we have a pretty cool sound effect, which a Mothman would envy.
What does it sound like?
I can't tell you because the sound effect they're using they're not paying royalties for.
Okay. So you start playing Pink Floyd or something?
I don't want them incarcerated before the next Mothman Festival.
Absolutely not. No. I think that's one of the interesting things, of course, because there was, as you said, definitely genuine witnesses to something, but what they were seeing was varying quite a bit. So, someone could make up what they claim to have seen, make a variation of the story, and you can't say, well, no, that doesn't fit what we know it looks like, because we don't know what it looked like. It kept kind of changing. So that is absolutely fascinating. I mean, you've been asked this many times, I know, but what do you, if I had to put you in court and say you have to testify as to what you think it was, what would you say?
I tend to think it was something paraphysical, but even that doesn't. It's almost like it was solid at times and more ethereal at other times. It was and going along with there was a lady named Mrs. Tomlinson that saw it toward the end of that year in the TNT area. She said it didn't fly, but it was walking quickly and jerkily like a robot. So perhaps something temporal, perhaps something paraphysical. Maybe it's, I keep going back to that great science fiction film, The Forbidden Planet, and the MacGuffin was monsters from the id. Perhaps something, while it seemed to be somewhat physical, perhaps these things we co-create somehow. But now there are other, if you look at the other cryptid reports, there are many winged creatures or whatever. Now, very seldom do you find one. A lot of people will dub things Mothman when it's just some kind of I don't know, Thunderbird or something else that didn't look quite like the Mothman. There was one case in Kent, England, almost exact.
Yep. The Owlman of Saint Mornan.
Oh, well, there was Owlman, but even almost exactly 3 years to the day, November '63, some kids were coming back from a dance, and I can't remember, what is it, Saltwood? Do I have that right? Anyway, it was in Kent, and they saw a light.
Different one.
Yes, this is a different one. It's just not the Owlman of Cornwall, but they saw a light come down behind a grove of trees, and then I think they saw another light appear, and the suggestion was it maybe morphed into something else, or they couldn't really tell. But this thing looked very much like the Mothman. I mean, it almost like they said it had no head. It had the wingspan, and it kind of shuffled along like the Mothman did. It did not have the red glowing eyes, but that was now that the suggestion there was that it may have morphed from some kind of a light or whatever. Paul Devereaux coined the term proto-entities. And that's a very interesting concept where he gives a lot of cases where somebody sees the light or the orb or what they think is the craft, and it morphs into the entity, the euphanaut or the creature or whatever.
Okay.
Now the other thing was the Mothman, its wingspan was about 10 feet, and it was about 6 or 7 feet tall. Probably a biologist would say the wingspan wasn't big enough to lift him off the ground, but this guy didn't feel like he needed to flap his wings all the time anyway.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere that basically if a human was to be able to fly by its own wings, the wings would have to be about 25 feet across, so clearly not big enough. The Mothman wings weren't big enough. Do you know where the term Mothman originates, where that name first came about?
Well, they don't know exactly who gets the credit, but they think it was some very creative copy editor. You see, the Batman TV show was very popular at that time, and so we just assumed that somebody did a play on the name Batman and called it Mothman, because it actually didn't look anything like a moth. It didn't have any of the features of a moth, even though if you look at the Mothman statue erected in downtown Point Pleasant, it's a very stylized version of Mothman, as are many of the T-shirts and illustrations that you see.
Yeah, I remember thinking that when I was seeing the statue before in photographs, obviously, that it doesn't really seem to match closely to the description. So it's an interesting, you say, kind of a style.
Every picture I've seen of it, it looks like a child's drawing or an ink blot.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. It was very simple. It was not there wasn't much to it. But I guess you can't, if you want to sell T-shirts, you got to punch it up a little bit.
Well, something you can sell, absolutely. Yeah.
Is it a harbinger?
Good question. There are some people that believe that the Mothman or whatever was going on that year. I mean, there were men in black. There was strange lights going overhead. Like I said, all this psychic phenomena. Some people believe that it caused the bridge collapse. Others say harbinger. My problem with harbingers is I wish they could be more specific. Something's doom is coming, and could you please tell me what it is so we can actually avert the tragedy? Others, like me, believe that probably it was just one of these, the incident happened at the same time, but is not directly connected. Although it's connected in space and time. I mean, people can't help but remembering the horrible tragedy of the bridge collapse and and all the other bizarre stuff that went on at the time. Now, it seemed that everything kind of dissipated afterwards. Now, it's hard to say if that's really the case, or if people's minds were obviously and just distracted on the bridge collapse and all the ramifications of that. But there's one sighting I know of that took place in the 90s out in the TNT area of some big winged creature, but it just didn't seem to carry on afterwards. But I really don't know. I mean, it's possible it could be a harbinger, but again, the harbingers don't seem to help us, don't really tell us what to look out for.
I mean,
I don't know whether I've told you this story or not before, Steve, but I saw something. I live in the middle of the countryside, and I've got a landing window at the top of the stairs. And one night I got up to go to the loo, and it was dusk. So, the daylight was starting. And as I looked out the window, I saw this thing about 200 yards across the fields flying, and it looked like a man.
Wow.
And it had wings, and the legs were stretched out the back like Superman sort of thing. Well, no, its legs were out the back. It was like he was laying on its stomach, and its wings were flapping. They were going up and down, and the legs were right out, and it was quite big.
Wow.
I saw that, and that wasn't the first time. Another time in London, we had a high fence between our house and the house next door. And I got up in the middle of the night because I was having an asthma attack, and I went out and sat in the garden. And I heard this flapping the other side of the fence, like a massive bird or whatever, flapping, going along the fence on the other side. So up, sort of flying up this person's next door neighbour's garden. And I just ran indoors. I thought it was a vampire. Friggin' Dracula.
I'll tell you quickly a brief story as we're telling stories of strange figures that people have seen. I'm pretty sure I've told Steve the story before, but I won't have told you, Irene. This is not my experience, but someone I used to work with many years ago.
Yeah.
She was, this is about 20 years ago. She was in her 60s. She was from Ireland. She'd come over to basically work, and she'd met a fellow Irishman over here, both in their early 20s. So we're talking a good few years back. And she said this, we were just talking generally about different stories and legends and sort of ghosts and that kind of thing. She knew my interest, and she told me about what happened. She said, absolutely, this is a true story. She said, definitely what happened. She was living in a shared house, and she was seeing this guy who she later married. And one particular evening, he'd walked her back to the shared house, and they were standing at the doorstep of the place about to go in. And he was tugging her a bit, and then he sort of turned her and said, "Don't look round, don't look behind." And so she was like a bit concerned and said, "Well, what's going on?" He said, just don't turn around. But of course she did. I mean, she was quite fiery. She said, "I'm gonna have a look." And what she described was across the road a bit further down. This is at night. It's dark, but there are street lights. So you could see underneath a tree was a man. standing tall and quite slim, very just black outlined, and had blue glowing eyes. And he said he kind of jumped backwards and just disappeared. It's like his arms kind of went out a little bit and sort of jumped backwards. And I know Steve's looked into Spring-Heeled Jack before.
Right.
It seemed to fit with that, but she'd never heard of it. I mean, she grew up in Ireland. It wasn't a story she knew anything about.
Yeah.
And I told her about Greek Spring-Heeled Jack and things like that, figures who fly and sort of disappear. She was a bit on the shocked side, shall we say, because she had no
You scared
idea.
her.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, she really was taken aback because she'd never heard of any of this sort of stuff and was good Catholic. She wouldn't believe in any of that sort of thing.
Mm.
But so the way he did it, he was really tall and his eyes were glowing like a blue light. And he kind of jumped backwards and disappeared. And it scared the hell out of both of them. I just want to go back to one thing we said before, Steve. Sorry. What was the time frame between? What's the closest sighting of Mothman to the collapse of the bridge itself? Was it days before, weeks before?
Well, probably one of the ones would have been the one that Mrs. Tomlinson saw, where it was she saw this thing walking into the in the TNT area because she was actually living out in that area.
Right.
So that was pretty close to the end of that year.
Right, so it wasn't far off at all. And
No.
did it definitely quieten down after the bridge collapsed, or was that just people's perception?
No, I think it was more than perception. It's almost impossible to say, but because they, Mary Heyer, who was the local reporter there, who became a friend and colleague of John Keel, they would go out south of there, down to Gallipolis Ferry, and way down in the hollers, out in the middle of nowhere, and they would see these strange lights. I mean, there was stuff going on all the time. But she used to write a column that was called "Where the Waters Mingle," because that's Point Pleasant is where the Ohio and the Kanawha River come together. And she's the one that was covering all the the Mothman sightings and the UFOs and Men in Black encounters and so forth. Well, she was certainly diverted from that sort of thing. I mean, that UFOs were the last thing on her mind, and Mothman once the bridge went down, and people were looking for family members and all that sort of thing. And in the days that followed, that's what consumed everybody, was the bridge collapse. So it's possible that things were still hopping, but who really cared, at that time?
True.
So I know Mothman is the most famous of all these creatures, but I think he's not the only one. I think there are many like this in different countries. Like I was saying about the Owlman in Cornwall. Now, the first sighting of him was in 1920, although the most up-to-date modern sighting was 1976 by two young girls.
Right.
And he used to frequent the old church steeple.
But he wasn't quite exactly the same thing. There was the Houston Batman. There was the Wisconsin Man Bat of a few years ago.
But
more like a big ugly bat.
What I'm saying is we're calling them an Owlman.
Right.
Can't get the word out now. Owlman and Mothman, but they could all be from the same species. Like dogs are different, aren't they?
Right. I just tend to think I'm just not sure we're dealing with physical unknown creatures.
I totally agree with Steve on this point. I think we've talked about this many times. We're talking about things that take on a certain form and guise compared to what you're expecting to see. I think once the idea of the local psyche got into people's minds that you look like a certain form, you start seeing a variation of that same form. But I remember one story I think I've told Steve before as well, which is this comes from Scotland in the 1800s of a Mothman-esque type experience of some sailors who were out fishing on a trawler. And so it was about 1880 odd, I think it was. It's one of the islands of Skye. Basically, the guys reported that they went out in their boat. There was 4 or 5 of them in the boat. So this thing landed at the top of the mast. It was about 4 or 5 foot tall with red eyes and stood there for about 4 days, just standing there looking at them. And they,
oh, bloody hell.
Exactly. But they had to fish because it was their livelihood. So they had to carry on. But this thing was still there and they just flew away. There's no bird would sit there for 4 or 5 days.
Maybe a seagull, but that's about it.
No, they're 4 to 5 feet. I mean, these guys were regular sailors, so they knew what the birds were, what they looked like, and there's none of those. So,
well, modern day cryptids don't hang around either. We get a brief glimpse. It'd be nice if they stick around for a week and a half so we could get a good description.
It would be as if they're standing above you on the boat and you've got nowhere to go. That's not so good.
So do you think that maybe these are something to do with UFOs? They come from the UFOs. Do you think it's from a parallel universe, or what? What do you think?
Perhaps I don't. The UFOs.
Or do you think it's a tulpa?
It could be all of the above. I suspect that some of these things have more than one explanation. There were a lot of UFOs seen at the time. I think of the in Pennsylvania in 73, 74. Stan Gordon chronicled a whole series of bizarre Bigfoot reports. Bigfoots with green glowing eyes that their cry was more like a baby. They would be shot with a shotgun and either disappear in a flash of light or be unaffected. But they were seen with all kinds of bizarre objects, lights, even looked like landed craft. I'm not sure that things are that simple where the aliens landed, let their creatures out to get some fresh air. It's almost like, I wonder sometimes if the whole thing isn't sort of a set like a stage. I call these things paranormal dioramas sometimes. I really don't know the cause and effect. Again, when people see these things, there was a Swedish researcher named Franzen, I believe, who was a sort of a colleague of Keel originally from a distance. When Keel wrote Operation Trojan Horse, this particular Swedish researcher got him all kinds of information on the ghost planes of Sweden in the 30s. And as to pay him back, when the Swedish researcher came to Point Pleasant, John Keel gave him a letter of introduction. So he went in, met all the witnesses, talked to more witnesses, and found out that it was almost everyone that had seen the Mothman had an outbreak of poltergeist phenomena. So how do we reconcile this with a flesh and blood creature? There was a really bizarre incident. I won't go into depth, but that Stan Gordon investigated, where 15 people originally see this craft or light. It came down. Some of them separated, and then they saw these two Bigfoot-like creatures moving along a fence, and even a local sheriff came out and saw one of them, and everything went away. The Bigfoots went away. The craft disappeared. And later on, the main witness, Stan and his team are out there. This guy starts having some kind of spell. He starts yelling and growling. And his father thought he was channeling the Bigfoot somehow. And this guy's stamping his feet, and then he collapses. Well, from his viewpoint, he doesn't remember any of that. He had a vision of a man like a Grim Reaper with a sickle, and he got dire predictions of the things to come. And then afterwards, this poor guy, this just average guy that experienced all this, he started having prophetic dreams of plane crashes that were coming true. And it's just like, what the, so often people that encounter these bizarre circumstances, it doesn't leave them. There's something that lingers, something that is very elusive, very hard to understand. So, so it just seems to me that so many of these things tend to want to move us away from a purely physical creature. But on the other hand, here's something really weird. When Keel went out there to the North Power Plant, he found these skinny little odd-looking footprints that he thought perhaps were Mothman. And but then he also found what he called these large dog-like footprints. And, shades of the dog man. You've heard of the Beast of Bray Road. Now, nobody was talking about upright canids at that time, but he said whatever made them had to be pretty heavy, hit several hundred pounds because of the way the depression went in the ground. So he consulted with Ivan Sanderson. Ivan Sanderson, of course, the great British naturalist, transplanted to New Jersey, wrote he's probably most famous for The Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, but he wrote great books on UFOs and the unexplained. He said the same thing. We keep finding these dog-like footprints in these paranormal hotspots. I talked to a retired professor from Wayne State University a few years ago. He was investigating Bigfoot reports and UFOs in Michigan. He said the same thing. And Linda Godfrey said the same thing. They keep finding these footprints, these dog-like footprints, and these paranormal hotspots. So you have 4 researchers separated by half a century, all telling us this. What is this telling us? What does this tell us about the dog man? And on that, the Point Pleasant is just one spot. We've heard about the Skinwalker Ranch, Marley Woods, and various places in the UK where a lot of different types of phenomena seem to occur. Well, I spoke at the Beast of Bray Road conference a couple of months ago, and a man named Lee Hampel, who he's got a farm where he bales hay, and he's retired. He was a mathematician for years, a man of science, really. He starts working out there near Bray Road, not really hearing anything about this this dog man, and some of his neighbors told him, he said, you got a werewolf on your property. He's saying, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. And then he starts finding the like roadkill disappearing, and he starts to experiment with the trap cameras and see what he can find. And the roadkill will disappear and nothing's photographed. He starts finding these footprints that don't match anything. 5-toed, a pad, and a heel. And they start in the middle of nowhere in the snow. And this one set, it's as if the creature was stepping almost right in front of the other foot. And then all of a sudden, they split into 2 creatures, 2 sets of footprints, as if it was carrying. I mean, I've seen these photographs. He's got thousands of photographs he's taken over the last 10 years. There's some kind of technology there, something in the sky, drones, just things that almost look like a portal. And he's had missing time out there. This guy is as credible as you can possibly be. He's finally has come out to he's kept some of these photographs close to the vest because they're so spectacular. But so anyway, you've got this bizarre situation, another one of these places where it seems like a lot of these places have sort of a predominant cryptid, so to speak. And then there's all kinds of other bizarre stuff that goes on, missing time. And I wish I could describe, if you go to the, I think Coast to Coast AM, he was on not too long ago, and he's got some of his photographs from Lee Hampel's farm near Bray Road. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know what to make of this. It's such a paradox. You think you kind of got a toehold on some of this, and then something else comes up that just completely obliterates your theory.
That's always what's kept me interested in the particular case are those cases like this that don't fit any particular category. And it is interesting that it's almost as if these things are trying to sort of emulate a human-like form, but not quite getting it right. I mean, the fact that supposedly man's best friend is his dog, so maybe you got a blending of the two there, the man and dog coming in together. I mean, as far as we know, sort of werewolf legends themselves have been identified more to do with a psychological medical condition that can cause men to overly grow hair and things like that. But again, maybe also these legends of werewolves is more linked to this particular experience, these strange sightings. But I know Steve and I, we've talked about this many occasions. The whole thing seems to point to something that's just not normal in this reality, if you like.
Yes.
An idea of an alien spaceship. Excuse me.
Well, let's face it, legends. Sorry, Andy, but legends and folklore, they all start somewhere, don't they?
Well, yes. That's exactly it. We have these ideas of what we think we're experiencing, and then we try to often get these experiences to conform to what we think we're experiencing. I mean, the classic one I've talked about before is you sort of paranormal ghost hunter type people and UFO type people seeing themselves as being separate from each other and don't even want to communicate, they think totally differently. What if they're both experiencing the same phenomena but seeing it from their own ideas and perspective? And I think that plays a big part in what we're saying here about the fact that these probably are non-corporeal, non-physical entities, but nevertheless are making impressions in our reality. That's the thing I find the most fascinating of all. I mean, we briefly mentioned the word tulpa there, but a tulpa is something that you specifically deliberately try to create. It takes
but I'm thinking to myself, if enough people believe in this, right?
But the trouble is, you have to have the thing first of all for people to believe in it. So it has to already have formed, if you like. I mean, there is, of course.
There's enough people that believe in it.
Yeah, I know, but the thing is,
maybe they've created some sort of tulpa.
But they have to have the sightings first, and then the thing has to be there to be seen first before they can actually say they're having sightings of it. When you're creating a tulpa, you're creating it first and foremost. It is possible that a small number of people got together to do that specific thing and did create it, but it would be the most spectacular example I think I've ever come across. But
there was that woman. What was that famous tulpa story to do with oh crumbs?
Was it Alexandria David Neal in Magic and Mystery in Tibet?
Yeah, there's
Yeah, that.
which of course that is very much in the home of the land of the tulpas, if you like, the people who've been practicing that formation for millennia. But also you have things like the Philip experiment, where you do have what appears to be a ghost that has been generated by the group that corresponds to what the group wants it to do. That's very tulpa-esque, but they set out to create it in the first place, and then it started to manifest. With the things like the Mothman, you're seeing it first, then people are reporting what they're experiencing. So it already had to exist for them to see it. You see what I mean? It's kind of the other way around. It has to be formed by people, and then they experience it because someone's done it. But this appears, and then more and more people are seeing it.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Unless collectively we all have these dark images lurking in our
and these
subconscious
abilities
that percolate to the surface every once in a while and just kind of pop out, scare the living daylights out of people, and then go away.
And as a Jungian psychotherapist, I would say absolutely, yes. We were talking about archetypal imagery, which we've talked about before, that this is a kind of a manifestation, externalization of the whole shadow concept, the stuff about ourselves we don't like, then forming into something that feels rather unpleasant and rather scary. Because most people were rather spooked by their experience, weren't they?
Well, you'll have to talk to me about that one.
Well, yeah. Well, we could do a show on it at some point in the future.
Yeah.
There is that. I mean, I say from that kind of perspective, that's very much how I see these kinds of things as being manifestations of the collective unconscious, these archetypal forms that exist deep within, and then they are becoming projected out. And it could be, as Irene said before, about myth and legend, that actually that's how they began, and then were absorbed into us, if you like, that these ancient stories are real and are true.
Well, there is so much folklore in this country, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, throughout the world, absolutely. And that was one of the things, and I've talked about this before, but one of the things that Carl Jung caught up on was the fact that there were similarities to folk legends and stories from cultures that had no connection whatsoever, that there's no reason why they'd have the same archetypal storylines and images in their stories, but they do. It suggests there's something more deeper, more collective going on there. And I do honestly think that these things are a manifestation of that element of us. They're real, they're out there, but they don't exist independently of us. There's some kind of formation process that goes on, a kind of a connection that's happening between us and these things. And I'm going off on one again, as I often do.
No, you're not. You're not.
Well, Andy, remember...
me and you are going to have a really good talk, boy.
Andy, remember Gustav Davidson in A Dictionary of Angels, when he writes that foreword, when he became so immersed in, he's compiling this dictionary of angels, including dark angels. And he talks about in the foreword, in one part, where he was crossing a field, an unfamiliar field one night, leaving a friend's house, going home. It's becoming dusk, and all of a sudden these horrible apparitions are popping up in front of him. And he's trying to get past them to get home. And when he finally makes it home, he wakes up the next morning, and he said he honestly didn't know if he was encountering a devil or an angel or whatever. But here, like some people that get Keel this happened to him, and other people, it happens to them sometimes, where they get so immersed in the UFO problem that they're having, men in black are knocking on their door. They're seeing strange lights right in their house. Keel talked about a guy he knew that was so absorbed in all this, he started seeing alligators everywhere. He'd go into the bathroom and see one in the bathtub. He'd turn on a tap, and instead of water, an alligator would come out. He was so freaked out, he thought he saw a black Cadillac with a man in black in it. So he actually shot at him. It turned out it wasn't a black Cadillac. It wasn't even a man in black. It was a friend of his. Fortunately, he was a bad shot and didn't hurt the guy. But this was somebody that and one of the guys in that's mentioned in the Mothman prophecies told Keel that he's just got to stop. He's got whatever. He wasn't specific about what was happening to him, but it was like it was overcoming him. And so Keel said, just get rid of all your files, go chase girls, just get off the subject. And John Keel in the Mothman Prophecies, one of his chapters is entitled "Paranoiacs Are Made, Not Born."
Yeah.
And he got, there was a point in time where he also had some other problems. There was some very physical, very human things going on where he was being harassed by the IRS and the phone company. It turned out, you find out from one of his later interviews, he had written a critical article on the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover was at the helm. And 2 weeks later, he started having some of the harassment that he describes in the Mothman Prophecies. Now, the Mothman Prophecies was half of it was cut out on the cutting room floor. Who knows if that was in there or not? But that's another thing. Sometimes things that we attribute to the paranormal or something mystical may be something just very mundane, although very unpleasant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you can get so caught up in these sorts of things that you don't even notice the obvious explanation for something. But,
Right.
It's one of those things. It kind of reminds you of the whole idea, though, when you get really caught up and you start to experience more. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I'm working on a book at the moment, which whenever I start really getting into writing it, it's to do with magic. I get funny things happening in my office and in our house. I mean, we've had for quite a while.
I had that when I wrote my first spy book.
Yeah, it's one of those things, particularly if you kind of engage sort of the mind. It's whether your mind is causing strange things to happen or you become more what we call cognitively biased. You notice these things more. I think there is something to the whole idea, though, that, as was said in the Mothman Prophecies movie, the Alexander Leck character said the thing about basically they noticed that you noticed them, and now they're going to notice you even more.
Right.
It's almost like because you've suddenly almost not like, I don't like the idea of taking your blinders off, because it all sounds kind of too conspiratorial, but once you start to see other things happening around you, you see more of it, or is it attracted to you? It's one of those chicken and egg things. You can't really be sure. But one thing I do remember very much when I used to be involved in the almost weekly paranormal investigations with the companies I'd worked with, you get some people who'd come along week after week, and the more they came, the more they experienced. There was no doubt about it. I can remember conversations with people who've been maybe once or twice saying not much happened to them, they're not too sure. And I'd see them maybe 2 or 3 months later at the same location, and they'd been to other events, and they said, no, we're seeing stuff now. It's really happening to us. There was no doubt people felt that they were experiencing more the more ghost investigations they went on. Now, whether it's because they were more aware of what was happening, or these things were attracted to them because they could see it more, I don't know. You could argue that both ways quite happily, but there's certainly a correlation between what you're doing and having experiences, which always brings me back to that strange point, Steve, how you've never experienced anything. That I always find that easy.
One thing.
You haven't, Steve?
No, one thing, and it was in Point Pleasant or near Point Pleasant a few years ago. I decided that I was going to go into the TNT area in the dead of night, and all I did is I went out there alone, and I went down one of the roads that have these old bunkers on it. And I was there with my flashlight and my recorder. I looked like a real paranormal investigator, and I had my camera going, and I went into one of the igloos, and then I walked back, and I started to drive back down Route 62. Well, at one point, I experienced a couple flashes of light, like a strobe light, and I couldn't figure out what the heck it was. And I did everything wrong. Because my excuse is this never happens to me. I didn't try to think, well, where was I along the road when that happened, so I could go back and see if I could figure out what it was. And so I went back across the river over to Gallipolis, where the motel I was staying, and I opened the door, and the TV set turned on by itself and started flipping through channels steadily. And I thought, no. This doesn't happen to me. This happens to other people. And so I did what any intrepid paranormal investigator would do. I unplugged the TV set and went to bed.
Just sat there all night watching, note the time and everything.
there is a postscript to this. A year later, the same month, I'm in the next room. It happens to be the next room. I'm in with a couple of my buddies. We're crammed in there saving money. And we're talking that night. And all of a sudden, the TV set turned on by itself. And in both cases, this was an older style TV and not one of the smart TVs. And I thought, that's weird. And then the next day, a couple of us went back to the room to get something. The TV set turned on by itself again, flipped through a couple stations, and then stopped. So we got scientific then. We were trying to use the remote to see if we could get it to work through walls or whatever. Nothing. So we just forgot about it. A few years later, it's the Mothman Festival. And in the next room, which is a corner at the motel,
Same
which
hotel.
is same hotel. This is a bigger room. Two couples are in there, and they have one of the smart TVs, one of the bigger TVs. Well, they're having trouble with the sound, and the sound, they have to keep turning it up and turning it up to hear it. Then all of a sudden it would blast, and they'd turn it down again and go through this over and over again. Well, there was some kind of a can, a soda can or whatever on the end table. Then all of a sudden that thing flew off the table and hit the floor. So my theory is that I brought something back with me from the TNT area, but fortunately he's still there flipping channels and didn't come home with me.
Stay in the hotel to annoy people instead.
But it's all...
I don't know so much about him still being there. My channels flip.
Well, this is all in the corner of this motel, so I don't have any idea. But I don't know what the I was trying to think back. I mean, how dark the road looked when those flashes. I mean, I might, and then the other thing is, the first thing I did when I got in, I looked at the clock to see if I had any missing time. And at the time, I didn't think I did. But in thinking back, I thought, well, heck, maybe that time was. See, I did everything wrong. I should have been writing down everything that happened, chronicling it.
Make a note. Yeah.
But I did not do that. So who knows? Maybe I was abducted by Indrid Cold or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. That it's all very well knowing what you're supposed to do, but when you're actually in the situation, it's easy to forget. I think, bloody hell, it's real. It's happening to me.
Well, I've heard other people say that. Joshua Cutchin said something like that when I forget what the situation was, but he didn't react to it. When I talked to that a lady from New Hampshire who contacted me some years ago. She and her husband, they were standing out on the front porch. It was early, about 5 a.m. They're having a cigarette. They could see these strange lights coming toward them. And then all of a sudden, they're not standing next to each other anymore. It's a little bit lighter. And they look up and they see this giant black triangle touching the treetops going over the house. And then they looked at it and they didn't think anything of it. And they went back to bed. Later on, they thought, well, that's bizarre, and realized they were missing a half hour. Now, she's a person that, Keel had these great catchphrases. He said, ask the contactee, ask the experiencer what they had for breakfast. Now, what he meant was not literally whether they had post toasties or muffins. Find out all about the individual, because he found that people were having all kinds of experiences. So I applied the Keel method, and I asked this lady, this is even before she had what she felt was finally a breakthrough with her missing time. She and her family were experiencing haunting phenomena. Both her sons were seeing orbs. One would see him outside his window. One was seeing one inside the house, which circled him. She saw a shadow person. And then I at one point I asked her, I said, this is going to sound weird, but I knew that people that had these experiences sometimes had seen a cryptid. And I said, have you ever seen something like a Bigfoot or something, an animal you couldn't identify? And she said, no, I haven't. But then she said, oh, wait a minute. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law saw something very strange near the property. What they saw was something like a panther, but standing on 2 legs. And this thing was seen 2 different times. So the point there is, if I had been stagnant in the 1960s thinking we're just dealing with ET landing, collecting soil samples, I never would have known to ask all these other questions, and I would have missed all these other aspects about her experience.
That's absolutely it. Is trying to approach this sort of thing as open in mind as possible, to not have any preconceived notions of what you think you're investigating. And that's the important point as I made before about the UFO people versus ghost people. There is a kind of tension of a assumed notion of what you're dealing with. I mean, it's a common thing in the ghost sort of investigation phenomena. There is almost a kind of Victorianized sense of what these things are. Let's use Ouija boards and let's have seances. These are definitely the departed spirits of the dead who've come back from heaven or wherever to talk to us, communicate, that we sent off into the light. That's just very much a Victorian idea when ghost hunting first became a popular pastime back in the days of the formation of the Ghost Club. But our world's moved on from that. But yet those methods still often remain the go-to way of dealing with this sort of phenomenon. I always try to have as open a mind as possible as what on earth you might be dealing with.
Well, there was a time when I didn't really. I was, 1960s. Jim and Coral Lorenzen of APRO had these great books on UFO occupants, and I was fascinated by the landings and the UFOnauts and so forth. By the way, we used to have some very cool UFOnauts. That's before the Greys took over and kind of spoiled everything, But and then when I read John Keel's Operation Trojan Horse, I was not happy with it at first, because that's where he started to demonstrate that the connection with all paranormal phenomena. And it was later on that he wrote the Mothman prophecies. But and he was right. And so I think Keel was just probably a century ahead of his time.
Yeah, I tend to agree that it was he and probably Jacques Vallée as well, the real pioneers of
Yes,
a slightly
absolutely.
different approach. Though, of course, Vallée was very much nuts about UFOs at first. He too
Yes.
really started to change his thinking, which I find. And one of the things I've encountered as well is people who know Vallée's work before the change, like they see Vallée as being very much the nuts and bolts UFO guy, and then the people who know his later material have a very different sense of what this guy was about, which I also find
Right.
quite fascinating, depending on
Well,
where you read.
Oh, I remember reading Challenge to Science and being fascinated by it. About the landings in France, the silver-suited humanoids and the egg-shaped craft and all that. And then, well, it was funny because I finally, I'm reading Trojan Horse, and I'm coming around to think that Keel's onto something. And then I read, I'm in recovery, and then I read Passport to Magonia, and so I had a relapse. So, but it's interesting. Keel a little bit earlier started talking about window areas, and he was trying to come to grips with why these things sort of seem to pop up and hang around for a while, and again scare people, and then they go away. But he also said about window areas that if you go back in time, you'll find out sometimes other things happened. And if you look at, for example, in Wales, 1977, all the 7-foot tall silver humanoids and strange lights and displaced cattle and all this stuff. It was
all still goes on here, I tell you, around my house.
But if you go back and it's an area where folklore was predominant. But then also this one family, the ones that they bought the Ripperston farm, the Coombs family. Before that they were living in a trailer, a caravan, near the shoreline, near a cliff, I think. And it was before
is that in Wales or in America?
Yeah, Dyfed, Wales, Dyfed.
Dyfed.
Yeah. Yes, the writers say you're supposed to pronounce it Dyfed, which is counterintuitive. It looks like Dyfed. But anyway,
that's Welsh for you.
I live in Carmarthenshire. I pronounce it Dyfed.
Okay, I'll go with your pronunciation then. But they when they were living in this caravan, they started seeing, now they were having some mild poltergeist phenomena going on with their wardrobe, and they would look outside their window and they would see an apparition of Mary in a white robe, and then she would eventually morph into an image of Jesus, and this would happen over and over again. And they would they actually had several hundred people over a period of time saw this before they moved. Well, this is right in the same area where later on all this UFO phenomena takes place, which is not terribly different. I mean, it's in another age, 100 years earlier, they would have said this was the fairies and the giants, that came to visit. So it's just interesting that maybe Keel was onto something there, where this, whatever it is with this particular area. Now, another thing Keel suggested, he talked about paranormal mimicry. He didn't necessarily think that all these creatures like the Yeti or whatever were paranormal. He thought perhaps some of them were actually physical creatures, but that there was this other variety, if you will, that were actually paranormal. He talked about paranormal mimicry. What if there are actually some flesh and blood Bigfoot-like creatures off in the Northwest or in the Himalayas, but then you have these bizarre counterfeits that show up in Pennsylvania with green glowing eyes that you can't shoot, and they leave 3-toed footprints instead of a normal footprint. So it's a mystery piled on a mystery, and
Mhm.
I'm not ready to say that there isn't a physicality to some of these, but I frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what the hell's going on.
That's the best answer usually.
I should have told you that in the beginning, and we could have just ended it.
No, I mean, it is. I think one of the things we have is these things don't conform to our conventional understanding of how we think the world works. But by the same token, over the last 1,000 years, how we think the world works has totally changed. We've gone from the idea of the sun being at the center of everything to realizing we're orbiting the sun. Little major changes like that. So maybe our thinking at the moment isn't in the right place to really understand what on earth these things actually are. That our current rationality, if you like, isn't sufficiently shaped to be able to engage with these kind of experiences in a rational way that we would understand. But unfortunately, the way modern science is today would be just to dismiss these things out of hand as being misidentification. And I often find it interesting when you read sort of the quote scientists, psychologists who give you an explanation of what person X saw, but person X was there. The psychologist chap wasn't. It's easy to say, yeah, I can explain it by this means, that means, but unless you're actually in the experience, how can you really be sure that what you say really works?
Right. Jacques Vallée said the phenomena negates itself, and it's in some cases it's almost like it's so bizarre that if you tell somebody what happened, it's just unbelievable.
Yes.
You can't wrap your head around it. And in other aspects, if sometimes people supposedly have seen a strange light in the sky, then they get a knock on the door from an official or something or somebody that says, "Don't talk about your sighting," even though they haven't reported it.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's this built-in, it's almost like, it raises the trickster aspect, which is something we haven't talked about, but that's sort of an undercurrent, man. You look at the Skinwalker Ranch, you look at so many of these areas and the things that people experience. It's almost like there's a petulant child behind some of this, just causing a lot of mischief.
Yeah. Although I suppose you can also say that that's again because we can't explain in adult rational terms. We'll go to something that we don't see as being rational or adult, this kind of almost gamesmanship is being played. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that often occurs to me as well is the fallacy of our memory, of how we describe things. One of the things I experience in my work with people, and I often ask them to them about their dreams, because your dream can give you an idea of how your psyche is processing what you're working with. But you always know that when you just try and describe your dream, you turn it into much more of a story that's more free-flowing than the actual dream was, because dreams just really jump around all over the place. So often we try to be as objective as possible in our description of what we think we've experienced, but because it doesn't necessarily have a frame of reference to something else you've experienced, i.e. if it's your first paranormal experience, then you can't help but colour what you describe in terms of what you understand. I mean, a good example of this, and I'm sorry if people have heard me talk about this before, was I looked into a lot into the sleep paralysis phenomenon and hypnagogic dreaming. Where people have that weird experience where they think
the hag.
Yes, exactly. They're awake and they're aware of a presence in their room or something strange has happened to them. I found with my own research was that if you had an interest in witchcraft, magic, occult kind of stuff, or any legends or myth stuff, then you tend to have the old hag syndrome experience, where it was an old woman sitting on your chest and you couldn't move or breathe. If you're interested more into science fiction or even just science generally, you tend to have more of a alien experience. And if you didn't have interest in either, you'd have things like you think your kids are in the room or somebody had got into the house. One guy I had as a client of mine many years ago, one of the things he talked about was he woke up in the middle of the night one night, found he couldn't move, but his children were playing under the bed and he had no idea why they were there. He kind of sensed they were there, but he couldn't see them, but was mystified as what they were doing there. And he said, I almost tried to call out to my wife, he said, but I couldn't. And then it was morning, I woke up. And he said to his wife, "Do you remember them?" He said, "No." He said to the kids, because the kids are old enough to sort of talk, maybe sort of 9, 10 years old, something like that. And they said, no, Dad, we didn't come into your bedroom. We got out of bed at night at all. So because he had no interest in either witchcraft, supernatural, magic, occult, or UFOs, aliens, spaceships, Star Wars, none of that, his mind created an imagery that made some kind of sense of the kids at the end of the bed. So that's what I found really fascinating, was the whole notion of how we perceive these experiences very much based on our experiences. Unless you experience something that's outside of your own experiences completely, and then it gets kind of really strange stuff is going on. And that's why some of these weirder phenomena, I think, is because we don't have a reference that we can make sense of. And when we try to explain it to somebody else, we do it in way that references what we know and understand, like the idea of being looking like a moth, like Mothman, or being a bat, like the Batman, or looks like a dog walking on its hind legs, Dogman. We're references to what we understand.
I've wondered occasionally, what if both are true? What if there is some kind of an alien presence or intelligence, and they're aware of this condition in humankind where we seem to experience or project images that we co-create somehow. But that would just throw a wrench in it. How would we how would we ever determine what is what? And perhaps if they were aware of this, they could utilize it to mask their activities, or perhaps they could, through force of will or technology, manipulate it so that we're really messed up and really misdirected as to what's going on. So I hope that's not the case, because we'll never figure our way out of that box.
The other side that would be is they are attempting to appear in some form that we can communicate with, but it's not quite working. It's taking slightly strange forms. I mean, that's one of the things I think we've talked about before, how UFO occupants tend to, well, Keel I think said this, but they tend to look roughly similar. They tend to have a certain range of height that's not too great a range, similar range of size. Most have 2 arms, 2 legs. The vast majority have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes. Faces that we recognise as face-like. And yet there are hundreds of these descriptions, but they have these similarities. I think we've talked about before. They're either coming from a planet that's very, very, very like Earth, or it is Earth, because they're breathing our air. They don't wear spaceships, or don't often wear spacesuits. They tend to have no obvious breathing apparatus. So there is some kind of uniformity of appearance that then is perhaps altered by us seeing them, or they project what they can create that looks a bit like us.
And some of them look very much like the fairies. If you were to exchange their silver coveralls for a little green tunic and red cap, they would look identical. And some of them, their conversations.
Is that where the little green men come from?
I try to remember where that came from.
Yeah, it's one of those phrases, isn't it? I know that.
Well, my dad used to say about this roundabout in London, you can walk under the roundabout. It's one of those where walkways underneath. And apparently somebody that he knew stopped there or broke down on the roundabout one night, and he looked down and there was a load of little green men. Now, whether Dad was having me on or not, I don't know. That's where I first heard about the green men.
I think just going back to what Steve was saying, I think it's probably very much true that these things have been seen for centuries, but they appear.
Now they're grey aliens. Yeah, they were green ones.
Tend to conform with what we understood at the time. That's why you have the myth of the fairies and taking you underground. Now we have aliens in spaceships taking you aloft. But I'm sure I remember reading some of the idea of them being grey kind of came about with Whitley Strieber and his writings. The community.
Yeah. Well, the thing is,
it was green, wasn't it? When I was young, it was green.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that was the catchphrase. But usually, if you look at the encounters that the Lorenzens talked about and Frank Edwards and so forth, you didn't get any of them green. They were in silver suits or the Flatwoods Monster or whatever. And the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, I think, were more silvery. If you look at the Greys, didn't really show up in mass, I don't think, until the late 70s, early 80s. Late 70s, you get Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Yeah. Early 80s, you have Whitley Strieber with that striking image on the front cover.
Absolutely.
So there may be a connection there.
I think someone pointed out a while ago, I can't remember who it was as well, that the UFOs suddenly became triangular in the early 80s, just as Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back and the what they call Star Destroyer started being on the screen. So the imagery enters the psyche. Now, it doesn't mean to say people are imagining these things, but again, these forms, these things taking on the general idea that's in the mind at the time. I do wonder, I know we've covered this before, but that whole idea of, again, you mentioned it briefly there, but this light, first of all, the first anomaly is light, a formless light that then becomes something, almost as if that is the pure form, if you like.
That's what Keel thought. He suggested in Trojan Horse that the objectively real part of the phenomena were the shapeless lights, and then they would focus in. He called them transmogrifications of energy, but he even thought in some cases people weren't really experiencing anything physical. They would go into a trance state and have the experience like Anne Jeffreys did in the 1600s. Remember her? Would have these. She wouldn't leave her bedside, she'd have all these great adventures with the little people.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that same kind of phenomenon, isn't it?
Yes.
So, what's it like working at the museum?
It's an absolute blast. The
He's in
museum
his
is
element.
the museum is so well done. It's right in the heart of Point Pleasant. You step outside, and there is the Mothman statue. My main purpose there, I work mostly on weekends and some other days, but the people that work there are usually so busy that when people have questions, they need somebody that has answers or can at least pretend he has answers, and that's me. So, but it's very cool because I have a lot of personal connections with the material there. I can talk about when I first encountered the Mothman or the story of the Mothman. There's even a magazine that I and my group in high school, mostly Kevin and Rick, not me so much, but we produced a amateur UFO magazine with Mothman on the cover, which is from 1968. So that's there.
Sure.
Excuse me. There's a newspaper article with Bill Edmondson in it. He's a man I met a few years ago. He was one of the survivors of the Silver Bridge. He was on a truck. He went down with the bridge, and he escaped, and a tugboat captain pulled him out of the water. And probably moments before, he would have died of hypothermia. So I have many personal connections, and I just ask people if this is the first time there and where they're from, and sometimes we get into just a great conversation. But I also tell them, and I'll tell you guys, about the Mothman Festival. Every third weekend in September. This year, I think it's the 17th and 18th. Now, up and down Main Street, you've got all the usual suspects. You've got T-shirts, you've got food, you've got bouncy houses, you've got a zip line. In the vacant lot, they have a blown-up Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, okay, from the Ghostbusters. Not quite as big as the movie, but pretty big. Now, on the perpendicular street where the Mothman statue is, that's where the speakers usually have their tables and their books, and they're very accessible. A lot of big names show up there. Nick Redfern, Rosemary Ellen Guiley used to be a fixture there, Stan Gordon, and on and on. And then they speak down at the State Theater on Saturday and Sunday. But the best of all is Saturday night. What you got to do is you got to get there early Saturday and get your ticket. That's the only thing that costs a few bucks, and that's a ticket for the hayride and a tour in the dreaded TNT area. We take people out there at night. We've got 3 tractors and 3 carts. Jeff and I and another young lady named Brittany, we are the tour guides, and Jeff has the only proper hayride. He actually has bales of hay on his. Brittany and I have what I call the old man carts with nice comfortable seats. So we take them into the dreaded TNT area. It's a little bit like a Halloween hayride, but the area is so creepy and atmospheric, you don't really need anything. But the first thing that happens, what's that?
Has anything happened while you've been out there on these rides?
Well, we set up some things to happen. The first thing that happens is that the men in black stop you. We got 3 guys dressed up in black suits, dark sunglasses, and they tell you things like, "This is a restricted area. You've got to turn around." But fortunately, they're more like the Keystone Cops than the real men in black. And then at one point, when you get by the old acid plant, 2 of my buddies take the Mothman down, which is normally hanging in the ceiling of the Mothman Museum. They take him out and they run him on a wire. They light up his eyes with battery power. They have this ingenious low-tech hand crank system to bring him down. And the sound effect is awesome. And again, I can't tell you the sound effect because I don't want these guys to be arrested. But it's just an absolute blast. It's just so much fun. One time, a lot of times I ask people where they're from or who traveled the furthest. And one time, a gentleman with a brogue said Belfast.
Oh, wow.
So he won that round. But it's just fun when with the little kids on there. They just love it. So it's just a really good time.
And is the museum particularly popular?
Oh my God, yes.
So,
That's why Jeff has been having me come in on weekends. I was just working a few hours, but now he's having me come in earlier. It just gets jam packed. So I just kind of wander around and I talk to people and I try and figure out if they want me to talk to them. If not, I'll kind of move on to somebody else. But I've gotten into just some just phenomenal conversations with people, just like we're doing now. Sometimes we get very heavy into it. A lot of times people this is their first time to the museum. Some of them, now what is really cool is we had one Saturday, we had a young man in from Mexico. We had two young men in from from the UK and a family in from Puerto Rico. They come from all over the U.S. And a lot of them, and I'll ask them, was this a planned destination, or were you just driving by and saw the sign? Because there's a sign out on the highway. And a lot of them, they've been waiting years to come here. So it's just, and it's so well done. Jeff has done such a phenomenal job. In the front part is a souvenir part where you can buy T-shirts and all kinds of stuff Mothman related, and the merchandise is very high quality. So, and he's running documentaries all the time in the background. There's one documentary that I'm in, but only toward the end you see the back of my head for about 3 seconds.
Oh,
I am in one. I'm in the Mothman Legacy.
I've got that. Yes.
You saw it, okay? But they don't run that one, so I can't.
No.
But I point it out every time I'm there, and you see the back of my head. I'll point to everybody. Look, that's the back of my head. You could tell I was going to be a star.
so this festival then, Steve, is it hundreds of people come or thousands?
Thousands.
Does it really pack out?
10,
Thousands?
12,000. And we haven't had it for the last 2 years, so I think people are fixing to bust loose, man, to come to this thing.
Wow.
It'd be the biggest one ever then if it's going to be like that, I suppose.
It could well be. There's. Are you familiar with?
Hotels are full.
Oh well, they get filled up. There is an old hotel, the Low Hotel, right there, but their prices go way up. You may have to remortgage your house to afford that one.
Cheeky people.
But there's several chain hotels across the river, and there's one hotel. If anybody wants to message me privately, I'll tell them what it is. It's kind of off the grid. It's well run, and the price is right.
It's
but
not near this TNT place, is it?
Oh no, this is on the other side of the river, so you're probably
you'd
safe.
want to be near there, though, wouldn't you?
Of course, that's the same. That's the same place that my TV went crazy. So maybe you want to. Yeah. Uh-huh.
What would you say was the most recent credible sighting in the area?
I don't have. I've seen small town monsters in the Mothman Legacy. I don't remember the specifics, but he covers one or two. I guess kind of Mothman type sightings, but they usually seem to be like just large birds. I mean, they still may well be connected, but I don't really, I remember one that was reported from a source that I don't trust, where it's supposedly a mother and daughter saw this thing at one of the hotels across the river in Gallipolis. And we went over there to kind of check it out. I suspect it was just fabricated. So I really don't know of any fairly recent real Mothman-like sightings. I could be mistaken, and as time goes on, I might find out. But
yeah, I kind of threw in the word credible because I imagine it's probably reported a week, but whether you believe them after been down the old the bar and had a few shots and a few shots and God knows what else.
and this particular sighting that I don't trust, it was much more man-like. It had a head and a face, and again, I don't know that the Mothman has a defined or had a very defined physical structure or boundary or whatever. So it could have been related, but it's just some of these things are just, there's so many things I have to suspend my judgment on. You just don't know.
So I think it's safe to say they've got you to dress up in a Mothman costume for the museum.
Well, there is. They got a really cool Mothman costume. The thing is, you have to be. I'd have to lose a few pounds to fit in it. It's really, really tight. You're going to have to.
You can't let the seams out then.
Oh, no, not on this one. And boy, it's going to be warm in there too.
I can imagine it would be.
Steve, Steve, what would you do if you came face to face with Mothman?
Well, here's what I hope I would do. I hope that I would be ready with a camera or whatever to really focus on the experience and just really pay attention and try and pull it all in. But that doesn't seem to happen with people. But these things happen when they least expect it. Even if they're out looking for something, all of a sudden, boom, it's there, and then they don't react. John Keel, he had a spectacular close UFO sighting in one of the hollers over near Gallipolis Ferry in the 60s. And he said he was transfixed. His camera, a movie camera, was right there on the seat next to him. He didn't touch it. But even for a more mundane things, there was a gentleman I saw at the Creature Weekend. He was a Bigfoot witness that was on Finding Bigfoot some years ago. He said one time he's sitting in his truck and he's got his camera with him, and all of a sudden a bear walked out in front of him and walked across the road. But he was so stunned he didn't react to even get a bear, which is a real animal.
That's the thing, is that that's suddenly being caught out here. Say if you are a paranormal investigator,
so right,
you can easily do that and think, oh, I missed it.
I would hope I would be in the present moment so that I could absorb as much of the experience as possible.
You'd stand there and take it all in. You wouldn't do the 50-minute mile then.
Hopefully I won't run and scream like a little girl. No offense intended. Into the next county.
Although I think one of the things we said earlier on that I think does play a part is it is almost like you go into some kind of fixation moment of trance-like state. I think some people experience quite literally, where they would have normally been like on the ball and ready. Well, possibly it's the unreality of what you're experiencing, but I think sometimes it is something's going on there. There is an interaction that's causing a reaction. Just very briefly, I don't want to boil the same story again. I know Steve has been saying this many times. When I was looking into think of the Dyatlov Pass incident back in the 1950s in Russia, I came across two separate stories of much more recently of one guy who was a security guard at a mine. He was there at night. He was used to being out at the night in the woods. And another guy was a hunter. Both well experienced, well used to being out of the woods, strange noises. And both of them at different times had a very similar experience of a strange yellow light moving through the woods nearby. And both of them are heavily armed, because it could be danger with rifles and machine guns, what have you. Both were freaked out by it, both frightened of the yellow light. And they after said no idea why, but they were just petrified. Both of them were. One heard the other one's experience literally weeks apart from the other guy, and the local news basically sort of had the stories, and they actually met up and talked about it, and they both agreed they had no idea why they were so freaked out by it, but they were absolutely freaked. So there is something to whatever you're seeing and experiencing that is actually causing you to have a reaction other than you would normally have had, even if you're an experienced investigator. So I think there's something to that.
There's a layer of something below that's just not apparent.
Yeah, it is. It has its strange effect in itself. That even if you're fully sensible and know exactly what you're doing normally, then you'll get thrown by it. And with that,
absolutely.
I'm thinking.
That was a dramatic pause.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I was thinking you either run, don't you, because you're absolutely terrified, or you stand there and face it like you would a dog. If you knew jolly well that dog's going to attack if you run, so you stand still.
Yeah, but I think even if you're if you're an experienced dog handler, would you still run?
No,
more calm and sort of collected. Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. If you'd have experienced investigator or the paranormal yourself and read reports, and then you actually have the experience.
No, but that's what I'm saying is when you see these things, it's the same sort of thing. You either I don't run. When I see things, I don't run.
But there is something there. I mean, look at the way animals react to this phenomena sometimes.
Yeah.
They sense it. Perhaps we're doing the same thing on some level. Is there some kind of a signal or something, maybe subconsciously, that triggers something, and we're not really able to act the way we would like to.
Yeah. Yeah, true.
Yeah. I think we're kind of moving towards the end of our show this evening. We've covered an awful lot, maybe a little bit of the same ground Steve and I covered before, but it's a fascinating topic, and I hope people listening get something out of this. That we are kind of saying that these are Mothman is the good example of how things don't always fit the categories we like to put these experiences into. That if you narrow the parameters to a certain range of what you're interested in, then you could miss stuff out quite easily. But it must be, say, just brilliant to have an interest like this, Steve, and then be able to actually live in the area where it all happens.
Yeah, I know. I never really thought I would move here because it's that special place. It's that, you don't move to your vacation spot. Where the hell are you going to go on vacation now? But it's it's really to be right in the heart of Point Pleasant. And I was here I came here in 1977 the first time after I'd read John Keel's book, just to look around. And back then you could actually drive into the TNT area. There weren't any barriers there. Then the next time was the 2006 Mothman Festival. And since then I've been crisscrossing Ohio for years to come down and visit friends or to go to the festival or whatever. But now, and I'm going to have to be careful not to gloat that when people are at the festival and they're an hour away in their motel and they had to park a mile away, I'm not going to say, oh yeah, well, I just live down the street.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this festival is every year?
Yes, every year, every third weekend in September, however that falls. This year, the 17th and 18th. And in the meantime, if you guys, if the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant is on your bucket list, come and see me at the museum. I direct people. There's the memorial, the bridge memorial is just up on 6th Street. There's a beautiful mural on the flood wall of the way the bridge used to look going over to Ohio. You go a little south to Tuende Park. That's where the two rivers come together. That's where Chief Cornstalk was buried, the first battle of the Revolutionary War. I don't know the history as well as I know the weird stuff, but this place, the history, the geography, the folklore, it's phenomenal. There's so much here, and it really is a beautiful part of the country.
There you are, people. If you're going to Point Pleasant, especially the festival, go to the museum, ask to speak to Steve Ward.
Absolutely.
I have an official name badge around my neck.
It's
Jeremy, who
Ward.
runs no, just Steve. Jeremy, who runs the cash register, he often tells people I'm just a homeless guy that wandered in there, but I've got an official badge. So there you go.
All right, now Andy, you
Yeah.
start saving our pennies. We're off there next year.
Oh, one of these days, I hope so. It'd be nice to see and actually finally meet after all these years. But mind you, saying that we've never actually met either. But one of these days, we'll all meet up
It
somewhere
could
in
happen.
the ocean, in the middle of the Atlantic. I think be where we'll end up meeting.
Well, anyway, we will be back together soon on
Absolutely.
the High Strangeness Factor.
As I was going to say, although I am now the co-host of this show with Irene, Steve and I will still be rocking in together with our High Strangeness stories and tales and interviews. But that's been a fascinating evening, I think. It's been
And
great
that's
for
all
us.
on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, people.
Well, it certainly is, and that's the idea. Tonight has been a kind of a soft relaunch of this show with a new co-host. Hopefully things are going to work out fine, but also a bit of a soft relaunch for Steve, as his show's been off the air for a few months with obviously moving house and other changes have taken up a lot of time, but with definitely everything's moving forward as it should be. So I think it's time to say good night, guys.
Yep, that's very true.
Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. Great to be back.
It's great to talk to you again, Steve. I've missed you.
And we shall all be, well, Ari and I at least will be back with a new guest in a couple of weeks or so. We shall see.
Yeah.
Speak to everyone soon.
Definitely. And people, if you wanted to know where you can find us everywhere. Just Google, and there we are.
We are in
Paranormal UK Radio Network.
on all the platforms, every listening device you can think of.
That's it. Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah, good night.
Nobody knows even why some houses are called haunted.
What would you call this place?
A deranged house. Such houses are described in the Bible as leprous. Before that, in Homer's race for the underworld, a house of Hades.
And you really believe that this was possible? That apes were systematically taken from this planet to another and altered? Selective breeding, atomic methods we can't guess. And return new faculties instilled in them by intelligence. Perhaps something else.
In effect, a colonization.
Dr. Roney and I are satisfied that these arthropods are not of this earth.